A constitutional crisis calls for an informed public since democracy depends on people who understand what is happening and are prepared to act. Listen to the League of Women Voters webinars and get informed. Get involved. Constitutional Crisis 50 Minutes. Unite and Rise 18 Minutes. Recorded June 23, 2026.
Thanks for being with us, everyone. Thank you for spending your beautiful Tuesday night with us talking about some fairly serious stuff. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to our U.S. Constitutional Crisis webinar. Thank you for being with us. I think we can just jump in. I think a lot of people in our country today sense that something is off, something is wrong. It just feels not quite like it should. We see kind of an increasing sense of conflict between our branches of government, a growing feeling of distrust in public institutions. And we're starting to hear debates about whether our constitutional system that's designed to protect our democracy is working. For most of us, these questions feel overwhelming. I am not a constitutional lawyer. Probably most of the people on this call are not constitutional lawyers, and constitutional law is complex and complicated. Government can seem abstract and distant. The relentlessness of the news cycle, especially right now, I think makes us feel inflamed, but not always informed. And that's why we're here today. So the Constitution was designed around a fairly simple but profound idea that no one person, branch, or institution should hold unchecked power. And instead, every branch serves as a check on the others, protecting both of our freedoms and our democracy. But we're worried. You've heard questions about whether we are in a constitutional crisis. And I just want to pause here. We'll go into what that means more deeply later in the presentation. But for now, I just want to give you just the most basic explanation. A constitutional crisis is when the executive, legislative, or judicial branches fail to protect the US Constitution. And so tonight we're going to explore concerns that have been raised about each of those branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. And we're going to examine why many legal scholars, civic leaders, and organizations, including us at the League of Women Voters, believe that we are in a moment of constitutional crisis. When our speakers are finished, we will share some important calls to action that each of us can take, because we know that ultimately democracy depends on an informed and engaged public, and it is our job, at the League of Women Voters, it is our mission to empower voters and defend democracy. And though the subject matter can get a little heavy, we hope that you leave tonight feeling empowered with both the power of knowledge and the ability to help engage more Americans in our democracy. And we can go to the next slide. The content of tonight's webinar is based on a very thorough and deep examination of these issues by the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, who did a very deep dive into the ways each branch of government is failing the Constitution. Their series was more than 3 hours long, and so we wanted to kind of essentialize their findings into a more digestible introduction into this moment. So we wanted to give enormous thanks to the Wisconsin League, and especially to their expert presenters. So speaking about the executive branch was attorney Lauren Miller Karalunas, who is the counsel at the Brennan Center of Law and a special assistant attorney in Cook County, Illinois. Speaking about the legislative branch was Professor Eleanor Powell, professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and co-founder of Women in Legislative Studies. And speaking about the judicial branch was attorney Stephen Vladeck, a professor of law at Georgetown University, who focused on the shadow docket of the U.S. Supreme Court. And we can go to the next slide. And I want to thank our presenters who you are going to get to hear from. So, Kara Dillon from the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus, Cheryl Roller from the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus, and Jay Ramathaman. I'm sorry that I think did not say that correctly. Please say it when it's your turn, from the League of Women Voters of Columbus, and Charlene Katzer from the League of Women Voters of Bowling Green. And some additional support was provided by Sophia Lombardo from the League of Women Voters of Columbus, by me with the Ohio League, and Karen Leith of the League of Women Voters of Hudson and the Ohio League. And we can go to the next slide where Kara is going to take over. Thank you, Kara.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And just as a reminder, Elizabeth just said it, but special thank you to Attorney Lauren Miller Karalunas for the original content and presentation from this, where all of this is coming from. So on our next slide, we'll see that we are working on the executive branch first. And just as kind of an overview, we always think of the president, but the executive branch also includes the vice president, cabinet, other agencies, and the office of the president. So while we mostly think of the president and the executive branch, there are other actors within this group as well. But if we think about our constitutional duties, those are that are explicitly outlined within the Constitution. We have the power to sign or veto legislation passed by Congress. This is one we're all fairly familiar with as we see legislation come through. Issue executive orders to guide agency implementation. So if we see executive orders about the Department of Education or the Department of Defense, that's where these executive orders began from our Constitution. Recommend laws to Congress specifically through the State of the Union address. So we will hear the president provide his kind of vision for the future through the State of the Union, which is mandated in the Constitution. And with Senate approval, the president and the executive branch can also negotiate and sign treaties. So we see that kind of actively ongoing right now. And there are also executive powers. Executive powers are simply the method through which the president and the executive branch can perform some of their constitutional duties. So, for example, the president can serve as the commander-in-chief in the military. Now we'll see in the next section, they can't declare war, but they can move military actions or move the military and serve as commander-in-chief during wartime. They can also grant pardons or reprieves for federal crimes. So we've seen that in action the past couple of years. Nominate cabinet members and federal judges, and appoint other key officials. So, for example, the Fed chair was just replaced, and that person was appointed by the president, but confirmed through the Senate. Next slide. Thank you. But there are some limits on executive power. So the president is given their power through Article 2. However, we have Article 1 powers and Article 3 powers. I won't go over into where these all land, but these are just things that are somewhere else or not the power of any particular branch. The executive cannot make or override laws. That is not their power. They also can't declare war, interpret the law, control federal spending, or appoint officials all on their own, and no one can override the rights of citizens as laid out in our Constitution. So we'll see how our current executive branch is taking steps over these limits on power, but I'll leave the specifics to our other two presenters. Next slide, please. And so we can see that there are a few abuses of power in action. I'm going to cover 3 areas tonight that are particularly important. And the first of abuses in action is the power of the purse. The power of the purse lies with Congress. If you kind of remember, in the fall of every year, we have these budgeting battles between our Congress. And this is where all the money that gets spent comes from, is from Congress. However, the executive branch has been taking actions that have been kind of made illegal and clarified the role of the power of the purse with Congress by the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. So President Nixon at the time was using something called impoundment to not pay money allotted by Congress to various projects he was against. And in 1974, the Impoundment Control Act said that impounding funds is not a legal action, and the president and the executive branch cannot do so. However, we are seeing a return of impoundment of funds where the president is simply saying, I do not wish to give these funds away, and therefore I'm not going to. There are some actions a president is allowed to take. You can do rescissions, that means the president can request from our Congress, both houses, the House and the Senate, to remove funds. However, that has to be passed, and if it isn't passed, then the funds have to go through. And we might see deferrals, which are supposed to be temporary delays. However, we can see with these four examples, we have 2 billion or more towards Harvard and other university grants that have been frozen, where the president had asked them to change curricula. They denied the request, and money got withheld that had been put towards Harvard and other universities. We see the National Institute of Health has had similar grant funds removed. They've also had over the National Science Foundation grants cut, but also funding that was supposed to go to employees cut as well. And finally, $5 billion around in international aid was pocket rescinded, which means that they did the legal request to rescind the money, but they did it in such a time Congress would never have the opportunity to say yes or no. So the money never went out to those agencies. Next slide, please. Next, we have rights and independent agencies. So we are seeing that the executive branch is attacking constitutional rights of citizens or legal residents of the country. So for example, we have declaring the birthright citizenship to be over via executive order, which we know that the executive doesn't have the power to make or override laws. So this is just kind of going against that simple idea. And again, here we have retaliating against Harvard for refusing to change the curriculum. That has to do with the budget, but it also has to deal with free speech and the ability for institutions to have their own curricula. We also see the Associated Press had their access revoked for not agreeing to specific wording from the executive branch, and which courts have declared that that is not an appropriate way to give or receive press passes. And finally, college students have been deported for political speech around the Israel-Palestine issue. And we are seeing folks with federally protected rights to speech, even though they're not citizens, but legal residents, deported for that political speech. We also have dismantling of some independent agencies. A lot of times this is also around speech or wording that is viewed unfavorably by the executive branch, but we have a couple other areas related to these independent agencies. So we've had the National Labor Relations Board, the FTC, and the Federal Reserve had all have either had agency heads fired or threatened with firing. And we've seen agencies become dismantled or pushed off into other agencies at the behest of the executive branch. For example, the Department of Education recently has had pieces of itself moved off into different areas of the government with the explicit order to get rid of the Department of Education. However, in the courts, it's hard to decide when an agency or a department is truly gone. If there's still a department head or a single employee, can we say that it's truly gone? Or is that not the spirit of what the powers are supposed to be? So that brings up an interesting question. Next slide, please. Thank you. And our last one is define the judiciary. We've seen this several times where we have instances where a court has ordered the executive to do or to not do certain actions. And 1 in 3 court orders currently are being defied by the executive branch, according to the Washington Post. So we saw this kind of happen twice with the deportation of an individual to El Salvador, where there was a court order to not deport this person, and then a court order to bring them back. And in both instances, the executive branch defied the orders and tried to skirt these orders in any way that they could. We've also seen ignoring funding restoration orders, where we have said you can't impound these funds, or this is no longer a temporary reduction of funds, and these funds must be released as promised to those parties. We see ongoing federal employee firings. So these employees are removed without cause and against union orders in some cases. And we're seeing that this has been labeled as inappropriate by other courts. And finally, threats against judges. This isn't necessarily a court order. However, we have seen instances where the executive branch is attacking the judges, saying that they are biased or making decisions based on political leanings rather than a neutral position rooted in our law and precedent, which makes it harder to have faith and confidence in the courts. And it makes it come into question whether judges are making decisions based on their safety and their life, or again, as that neutral third party that we want from our judiciary. So in these ways, we are seeing the executive branch overstep and try to step into the powers of other branches of government. Next slide, please. And just as a final reminder, thank you to Lauren Miller Karolynas for building out the larger portion of that presentation that we just took a small portion of. And then next, we will have Cheryl Roller.
Thank you, Kiara. Can you hear me okay? I'm still getting in. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Thank you. All right, next we're going to look at the crisis in our legislative branch. And again, thank you to Professor Eleanor Powell, who put together the original material and presented it in a 60-minute presentation with 30 minutes of questioning. And I'm trying to do this for you in 15 minutes. Next slide, please. So we've known for a long time that the public is dissatisfied with Congress. In fact, only about 15% of the public approves of the way that Congress is doing their job. Therefore, political scientists all over the country and all over the world have been studying congressional dysfunction for many decades. Next slide, please. So when Professor Powell put this roadmap together, she divided it into 5 portions. So first we'll look at the founder's intention. Are there flaws in the design? Secondly, we'll look at long-term trends for congressional dysfunction. Third, we'll look at what's new and different now. Fourth, we'll look at why has Congress relinquished their power to the presidency? And fifth, can Congress be redeemed? Next slide. So when the Constitution was written, it was written against the backdrop of the tyranny of King George, which you all know was the Revolutionary War. And it was written just coming off of the failure of the Articles of Confederation, which was our first attempt at governance. And that had a weak national legislature and no executive to enforce Congress's will. So the founding fathers, getting back together, decided they still needed to come up with a better way to do this to avoid the tyranny that they had seen before. And they decided that they needed to use separation of powers and checks and balances. And they needed to build a stronger Congress. So Congress is actually mentioned first in the Constitution as our most important institution. Next, please. It was the founders' idea that the Congress should legislate policy and the executive carries it out. It was the idea of James Madison that ambition should be made to counteract ambition. In other words, we can't have too ambitious a president if we have an equally strong Congress, because they will counterbalance each other. Now, when the founding fathers were creating the Constitution, they didn't have a lot of good examples to work from. So they were building this from scratch. Next slide, please. So as they built this from scratch, there were a lot of presidential democracies created afterwards around the world, not all of which were very successful. So as political scientists have studied our current congressional dysfunction, they've kind of compared our presidential democracy to parliamentarian democracy. And they've found some of the issues with presidential democracies are that it often leads to two branches in conflict. The conflict between the president and the conflict with Congress, which can lead to gridlock. They've also noticed that in presidential democracies where the presidents have fixed terms, it can cause a crisis because it's so difficult to get rid of our executive versus in a parliamentary system. In fact, we've seen most recently in Great Britain, they've gone through like 5 prime ministers in 6 years. So that's another potential flaw in our current design. They've also noticed that it's kind of creates a winner-take-all logic. When one party is control of all 3 branches, it can really exacerbate polarization. And because our president or the executive is the symbol of national authority, that in and of itself can lead to authoritarian tendencies, particularly if Congress and the courts are weak. All of this can lead to a potential for democratic breakdown. Presidential systems are more likely to collapse into authoritarianism than parliamentary systems. Next slide, please. Now, in the past, the US has always been viewed as the exception because of the great example of President George Washington, who voluntarily stepped down. And because in the United States, we have traditionally had a lot of education in our high schools about civic responsibilities. And we've always placed a high value on democracy and following the rules of the game and the constitutional process. It's kind of led to a mentality that this can't happen here. But we're looking much less exceptional now, and we're in a position where we have great concern about the creeping powers of the presidential executive. So continuing with this thought of what are the long-term dysfunctions, for the last 40 or 50 years, there have been problems with appropriation and budget processes. At a minimum, it's Congress's job to keep the government open and running by passing the budget. But even before the current administration, the budget was often late, and budget failures lead to shutdown. There's also been a problem with Congress's failure to reauthorize or to end programs. Most laws and programs are built with an expiration date, and Congress isn't reauthorizing them. Congress is letting authorizations expire, but still funding them. This can lead to zombie programs. Also, there's been a declining oversight of the executive branch and a decrease in oversight hearings by Congress of the executive branch. Next slide, please. Another general issue of the long-term dysfunction has been the failure to negotiate and compromise between the different branches, which can lead to gridlock. And that gridlock can sometimes be because of more loyalty to the party than to their constituents and to the Constitution, particularly in places where the party can punish disloyalty. So all of this has led to increasing gridlock in Congress. Another issue that is sometimes overlooked is that in the 1990s, Congress got rid of a lot of their professional staff. They downsized both in the individual congressional offices and in the agencies that support Congress. So what has also happened with fewer staff members and poorly paid staff members, it's become kind of a revolving door and a brain drain. So this has all led Congress to increasingly delegate policymaking to the federal agencies, which concentrates even more power in executive agencies. In addition, Congress has been spending less time in session, so they're less able to get things done. Next, please. Now, what's new and different? What's changed with the recent administration that is beyond the dissatisfaction we had with Congress over the last 40 or 50 years? So one of the things that is very different is that the executive office, our current president, has been breaking long established norms. So now the consequences are very different. Next, please. Congress has been ceding control of the power of the purse. Kara got into this and did a great job describing impoundment, rescissions, agency shutdowns, and firings. So that's a very important thing that's happening now in greater quantity and more often and deeper than ever before. And Congress has not been pushing back against presidential abuse of emergency declarations, such as tariffs. It's also now harder to override a presidential veto. It takes both houses of Congress to act now. This has also led the president to increase the scope and scale of executive orders. They've always been used in the past, but now more than ever, much greater quantity and the scope of those executive orders has greatly expanded. And Congress is not pushing back against major norms violations, such as the politicization of the Justice Department. Next, please. It was clearly the founders' intention that Congress should control the purse. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and count of the receipts and expenditures of all public money should be published from time to time. It's Congress's big tool to control the executive branch. And there have been some recent things in the news, such as the reflecting pool and the ballroom, that were initially supposed to be done without any taxpayer money. And then we're finding that none of that was appropriately taken care of. Next, please. During the 2024 campaign, candidate Trump indicated he planned to restore executive branch impoundment authority to cut waste, stop inflation, and crush the deep state. Impoundment, which is the executive refusal to spend funds appropriated by Congress. We now, and Kara mentioned this, in 1974, we have the Impoundment Control Act, which our current president is saying is unconstitutional, and therefore our current president is ignoring that. So that's headed to the Supreme Court for resolution. Next, please. Rescission is a better way for changing course as far as the power of the purse. This, as Kara defined, it's when the president lists a specific budget provision to be rescinded, and then the Congress has to vote on it. So this is at least an acceptable process and has at times been used appropriately in the past, but it's being way overused now. Next slide, please. And it has very bad consequences. Because as you can imagine, any time that the Congress is putting together a budget and negotiating with the president, and both sides believe they have an agreement, and then the president immediately says, nope, we're going to rescind that, that leads to great distrust on both sides and causes a situation where Congress is no longer willing to even negotiate about these things, which leads to delays in getting things done, if at all. Next slide, please. So why has Congress relinquished so much of its power to the presidency? Some of this has been deliberately shifting power because the nation's political economy has expanded so much. There's a need to offload some governmental authority to the executive. There's so much to do. And as we already said, the congressional staff has been cut, and particularly the staffing at those agencies that are designed to help Congress do their job. There's also been crisis-induced shifting of emergency powers. But once a power gets shifted to the executive, it's very hard to get that power back to Congress. So Congress's recent inability to perform their basic duties, budgets, reauthorizing expanded programs, ensuring that the Treasury can borrow money to pay our debts, all of these have greatly increased. And in a unified government where all three branches are of the same party, there's no incentive to check the executive power. A further advantage the president has is the president usually takes action first and the Congress is in the position of reacting. So those have all caused Congress to lose more and more of its power to the executive branch. Next, please. So can Congress be redeemed? Well, one of the things that could be done is to improve their capabilities, to reverse those cuts to their staffing, to pay their staff appropriately so that you get good people and you keep good people, and then to strengthen the congressional information sources and the investigatory resources so that they can do the work and provide the answers that they need to do good legislation. And then there are changes that the voters need to make. We get better government when we don't have it all controlled by the same party, because then ambition can check ambition. And then here's another dirty little secret. Sometimes Congress members will vote against something that could benefit their own districts. But then what's happening, they're going behind the scenes and directly to the White House and getting special benefits for the people of their districts, even though they've voted against the general legislation. So that's something that needs to change, and only the voters can change. Next slide, please. So obviously the voters need to care. There's too much information that is siloed, hard to get, and too much misinformation out there. It's hard to get reliable information on what is happening. But ultimately, it's up to the voters to save democracy. The media can help, both traditional media and our social media, but they have to understand what is happening. And we, the League of Women Voters, this is part of our work, to get the correct information out there and to help voters understand why this is important. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A session was, what about term limits? If Congress is not doing a good job, why don't we have term limits on Congress? But that's counterintuitive, because that would make the executive even more powerful relative to Congress. Because as newer congressional members come in, they are overwhelmed by the size of the job and learning what it takes to govern. So keeps coming back to change starts with the voters. And our job is to educate and engage voters to safeguard our democracy. I'm now going to turn it over to Jay for the judiciary.
The crisis in the judiciary. Speaking about the judicial branch, attorney Stephen Vladeck, professor of law at Georgetown University, focuses on the shadow docket in the Supreme Court. This is a 15-minute summary of that presentation by J. Ramanathan at LWV Metro Columbus. The federal judicial structure. U.S. Constitution Article 3 established one Supreme Court. Congress may create and reorganize lower federal courts. So the key principles are constitutionally grounded system, institutionally adaptive. And this is illustrated by the figure on the right. A single court system, the U.S. Supreme Court, with the U.S. Court of Appeals and the U.S. District Courts within that system reporting to the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court has a merits and a shadow docket. The merits docket contains cases that are argued with full briefing, with oral arguments, and detailed reasoning. It results in signed opinions and has public transparency and visibility. The shadow docket is also referred to as the emergency or interim or non merits docket, handles matters that require immediate attention before a final, fully argued decision can be made. These cases are often unsigned, expedited interim rulings, which are given till a full court can consider the case. It has limited explanation and limited public visibility and transparency. The U.S. Supreme Court uses the certiorari process as the process by which the Supreme Court decides which cases it will choose to take up for full review on its merits docket, or it will move those cases to the shadow docket. The shadow docket was designed for emergency relief. Historically, it addresses cases which are narrow procedural emergencies, such as stays of executions, injunctions prohibiting certain actions like deportation. It preserves the status quo, minimizes harm during the appeals process. Temporary relief is given through this process while the courts work through the legal arguments. Traditionally, it is not intended for broad national policy outcomes. The concerns about the shadow docket are as follows. It supports radical acceleration by granting many more emergency requests for the Trump administration than previous administrations, while showing significant internal ideological divides within the Supreme Court justices themselves. And there is a guidance gap. Emergency stays are, in short, unsigned paragraphs, brief, no explanation for how district judges should interpret and apply older precedents, forcing lower courts to navigate conflicting legal standards. The rulings covering broader national impact and greater ideological controversy is another concern. Yet, Justice Gorsuch directed lower courts to treat emergency or shadow docket rulings as binding guidance on August 22nd, 2025. In a concurring opinion joined by Justice Kavanaugh, he rebuked district judges for ignoring prior Supreme Court emergency orders declaring lower courts and judges may sometimes disagree with the Supreme Court decisions, but they're never free to defy them. So, what is the tension? What is happening is lower courts reportedly have difficulty interpreting unsigned emergency rulings from the Supreme Court. And critics are concerned about this because major rulings occurring without full judicial process are troublesome when they set precedents for lower courts. Limited guidance creates uncertainty. Courts struggle to apply precedent consistently. Institutional friction may weaken confidence in the judiciary. And why do supporters defend it? Supreme Court orders remain remain binding authority, and lower courts must follow court's direction even in emergency matters. So here is an example related to Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, in the vaccination case of 2022. What happened is that the Supreme Court's ruling on OSHA vaccination mandate in January of 2022 is an example of the court using an emergency application on the shadow docket rather than the full merits process to block federal mitigation measures. The court blocked the OSHA vaccine or test mandate and stated that balancing broader trade offs on the impact to society was not the court's rule. Why critics were concerned in this specific case? There was a reduced emphasis on weighing public health harms, narrow focuses on legal authority rather than societal impact, and this signaled a shift in emergency relief standards overall. And why supporters defended it? OSHA exceeded authority granted by Congress. Courts must enforce constitutional and statutory limits, uh, even if they are the result of briefs and unexplained decisions. Another example is the voting rights and redistricting case. What happened was the Supreme Court allowed disputed Alabama and Louisiana district maps to remain in place during appeals. Why critics were concerned? Election outcomes may have been affected before full legal review. Lower courts had already found Voting Right Act concerns that could be ignored, and emergency orders influence representation in Congress. Supporters defended this because they felt that the court should avoid changing election rules close to elections. States require stability in election administration, was the claim that was made. So we want to focus now on the principles for the federal judiciary. Cases with broad impact must go through the merits docket. Oral arguments that provide transparent explanation so lower courts are left with guidance on how to apply the law in future cases. Uncertainty for lower courts due to shadow docket rulings which do not often clarify which of the parties' arguments were accepted. So the lower courts cannot discern the legal principle behind the ruling. And another thing to avoid is that courts may end up treating mystical or overly blunt orders as binding precedents, even when the underlying reasoning is absent. We want institutional accountability. By failing to provide reasoned opinions, the court stops articulating the neutral principles or shift in legal doctrine necessary for preserving the rule of law and holding the executive branch accountable. So the result is that there is a tension in the judicial philosophies within the system we presented up at the beginning. Again, we have the district courts, courts of appeals, and the Supreme Court in this hierarchy. Judicial restraint and originalism takes a top down approach, interpreting original constitutional meaning and avoiding policymaking. However, a more adaptive approach treats the Constitution as a living Constitution, noting that principles evolve over time and the courts must protect the rights and inclusion as evolution takes place. The critics then of the shadow docket expand the use uh, 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 are against the expansion in the use of emergency orders, lack of explanation, inconsistent standards, and reduced balancing of harms, setting an ambiguous precedent. The supporters of the shadow docket, on the other hand, for example, organizations like the Heritage Foundation, treat nationwide injunctions by district courts as improper uh, in restraining executive power, particularly in cases involving executive officials. It places those agencies or officials under judicial receivership, which contradicts the constitutional structure where the president, not the court, holds executive authority. Another claim made by supporters is stronger executive authority supports constitutional balance, and emergency orders are legitimate supervisory tools. This leaves us with some questions to think about. What reforms could strengthen trust in the judiciary? Since the Supreme Court controls the lower courts, should unsigned rulings carry precedential weight? How much transparency and recent guidance is required for the lower courts? How should emergency powers of the executive branch be limited? How do we apply principles such as respect for the separation of powers, consistency and equal standards, judicial independence, and commitment to the rule of law? What balance should exist between restraint and rights protection?